Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It's considered a major breakthrough in negotiations to end 2 years of devastating war, with word Israel and Hamas have agreed on the initial terms of President Donald Trump's proposed peace plan. The two sides now preparing for an exchange of Israeli hostages for Palestinian prisoners expected to begin as soon as this weekend. The deal promises at least a pause in the fighting that set off a humanitarian catastrophe and widespread hunger in Gaza. But some of the most stubborn sticking points appear to have been left to a future phase of negotiations, raising questions about the prospect for lasting peace. I'm Caryn Ceolin, and today on The Big Story, I spoke with former Canadian ambassador to Israel, Jon Allen. We spoke just before the agreement was announced about what it could entail and why there's still uncertainty about whether it'll translate into a permanent end to the war. Mr. Allen, thank you so much for making the time to speak with me today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Can you begin by just giving us a brief overview? What does the Trump peace plan envision?
Well, it's multi-phased, although it doesn't actually say that. It's 20 points, as you know. It starts with what is being negotiated right now, which is the release of all of the hostages, both alive and dead, an exchange of Palestinian prisoners, 250 approximately, who have been in Israeli jails for a long time for significant crimes that they've been convicted of, and about 1,700 who have been detained since October 7th. And it obviously involves a ceasefire so that that can take place. So that's the first part. And then the hope is that the ceasefire is maintained and that a technocratic government appointed by the Palestinian Authority would eventually move in, probably before they might be named before they would move in. You would have Hamas disarm, and a stabilization force, an international stabilization force, led likely by Gulf and Arab states with assistance from Western countries, that would come in, ensure that the ground was safe, that rule of law was restored, and that this technocratic government could begin to operate the normal services of policing and garbage and distribution of, with the UN and others, of humanitarian assistance. That would be the first step. A board is provided for, an oversight board that would be co-chaired by Donald Trump and Tony Blair, the former UK Prime Minister. And there would be various committees under that board that would oversee what was taking place in Gaza. And then there are other items that are more ambiguous, but they talk about envisaging a pathway to a Palestinian state if certain benchmarks of governance are met. And very importantly, it talks about an Israeli withdrawal, which has to happen before, frankly, this multinational task force would come in.
There are, of course, many aspects of Trump's proposal that I want to ask you about, but I want to start with the first phase, the hostage release deal.
You know, whatever you think of Hamas, and of course, they are a terrorist group designated by many Western countries. They did commit war crimes and crimes against humanity on October 7 and have continued to. You do have to negotiate with your enemy if you're trying to solve a conflict or aspects of it. So Hamas is concerned that they will release the hostages and get some prisoners back and then the Netanyahu government will restart the war. So for them, having Israel withdraw to certain lines, they have been talking about the lines that Israel was at when the first ceasefire was negotiated in January. Again, I've heard there are some other lines, not quite as far back as those, but so that's clearly an issue. There's still an issue of which prisoners are going to be allowed to be released. Israel has said publicly that it wants to have a veto over who is and isn't released. Hamas is submitting names of people they want released, and so that has to be resolved. And of course, then Hamas has to gather all of the hostages, both dead and alive, in one place, so the International Committee of the Red Cross can then assist in the return of those hostages to Israel.
Let's say they're, able to get over those stumbling blocks in the first phase and, they iron out the details of this exchange. How do you do that, though, without addressing those sort of persistent sticking points in the second phase of Trump's plan? And in particular, disarmament, which, Hamas has said it has long resisted. It still has said nothing about it. Is this going to derail, I suppose, the chances of any diplomatic breakthrough?
Well, I think it will. And I think, as I just mentioned, the idea of IDF withdrawal and disarmament go together. So if either side decides to take a hard line on that, then it may not happen. And that's basically a question of trust. Hamas spokespersons have said that they are looking to the Trump administration, and I think to primarily, but also to other Arab states who are involved in these negotiations, to give them some guarantee that once the hostages are released, the war won't immediately begin again. And that's why they are concerned about disarming before they get those guarantees or before the IDF withdraws to certain lines.
From your perspective, what would those guarantees have to look like, though? Because as you've just laid out, it's unlikely Hamas will free the hostages before working out those details, because the group would essentially be giving up what it views as its main leverage with Israel. So what would those guarantees have to look like in order for, peace to be achieved here?
I think Donald Trump's Mideast negotiator, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, would have to make it clear to the Prime Minister of Qatar and to the others that are there, including the Israeli delegation, that there would be consequences on Israel if they restarted the war. Really, that's the key there. If Hamas is going to disarm, and disarming is a complicated process. It took years in Northern Ireland for disarming and decommissioning to take place. But if they are going to do it, then they're going to want some, as I said, assurances. You asked, what are the insurances? They're basically the Americans telling the Israelis there will be a price to pay if you renege on this deal and then restart the war. Because, behind the scenes, Donald Trump wants his Nobel Peace Prize, and he won't get it just for a hostage release.
Trump's plan in many ways currently checks basically every box on Israel's wish list. But I wonder if it's possible Israel could relent on any of its demands, just under pressure from Trump to reach a deal quickly.
They could. to be honest with you, I have a greater fear that they will renege and that they will restart the war. And I wouldn't be surprised if the prime minister is telling his right-wing messianic ministers just that, stay in the coalition, don't worry, we'll get the hostages back, and then we'll find some way to say that Hamas is breaching the deal and we're going to go back in. And I think, Hamas and the countries negotiating on its behalf are very aware of that. So will Israel find ways to compromise and decide that perhaps ending the war right now would be a benefit to everybody concerned, including IDF soldiers and the Israeli economy, etc.? It's possible. It's possible. The downside for Netanyahu is that he would then face increased demands for a commission of inquiry, both into what happened on October 7 and how it happened, and how the war was prosecuted. He is very concerned about that and wants to avoid it. He would also have to spend more time at his trial, being cross-examined. They're at the cross-examination stage. Now he has various reasons for saying that he can't attend. Then he'll have to face an election at some point between now and October 2026. So there are reasons why he would not want the war to end. Then there are reasons why he's begun to spin this agreement as something that Israel came up with and Israel wanted, and that the hostages will come back, and that he has now brought peace to the region by defeating Hezbollah and Iran, and weakened Hamas very significantly and potentially disarmed them.
I just wonder, is Netanyahu really in any position, just given the context that you've laid out, to defy Trump and also considering, Israel's growing international isolation?
Yeah, I think as Prime Minister Netanyahu has indicated, he's less worried about Israel's international reputation in isolation. He seems to fight back on criticism of Israel's war efforts, criticism. He fights back against the recognition of Palestine, of course. So that's not an issue for him. Increasingly, that's quite clear. He had a speech in which he said that Israel would become Sparta, super Sparta, which essentially means isolated completely in the world, and it would do just fine. When the markets reacted badly, he backed away from that language, but that's the way he feels. As far as the Americans are concerned, that's a different story. I mean, that's weapons, that's supported the UN, the UN Security Council. So the Americans have leverage, but Prime Minister Netanyahu has played any number of former U.S. presidents, from George W. to Barack Obama, to Biden, of course. And, up until now, he's basically been able to convince Donald Trump that a victory against Hamas was just a weeks away, even though the war has been going on for 2 years. So there are ways to try and squeeze out of this agreement, which he could try, and Donald Trump is so unpredictable, so completely unpredictable, that no one could really know how he would react if the Netanyahu government decided to restart the war.
Yeah, let me pick up on that point, because under Trump's plan, it says if Hamas fails to live up to its commitments, or at least this is what the president has said, Israel will have the full backing of the Trump administration to finish the job. And so you are more concerned about the possibility then that Israel could actually intensify its military campaign with the full support of the U.S. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean that's a possibility, and unfortunately, who suffers from that? The Palestinian people in Gaza suffer from that. Hamas has they will have decided that they're prepared to die as martyrs, continue the insurgency as long as they can. But the people in Gaza, if the ground invasion of Gaza City continues and the humanitarian crisis continues, they are the people that are going to suffer and have been suffering. The hostages will be back, and that will begin to ease the trauma in Israel, but it may also reduce the pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu regarding the war. The sentiment in Israel to end the war is almost all related to the release of the hostages. Once they are released, they too could stop protesting. I don't know if they give Netanyahu a green light to start the war, but the protests would be reduced.
What does that tell you then about the chances of securing a lasting deal? Are we being fed false hope right now?
Well, I think we should be very wary about being optimistic about this. I think there are so many complications, obstacles, and a justifiable lack of trust between the two main parties that being optimistic is a recipe for being very disappointed. I'm not even sure I would say I'm cautiously optimistic. I seem to be. I started out by feeling that as long as the bombing stopped for even a day or 2 days and the suffering in Gaza was eased and the hostages were released and the prisoners came back, that would be a good thing. And I continue to think it would be a good thing because it would be one step. But it's, very hard to predict what both sides are going to do next. And as I said, there's not a lot of trust. And if you had an American government that was committed for the right reasons to this and prepared to really exercise leverage over the Israelis, because I think the Qataris and the Turks and the Egyptians could exercise considerable leverage over Hamas. Not complete, but considerable.
Where does that leave the rest of the West, and in particular, Canada?
Yeah, I am concerned that leading, before Trump announced this, before he met in New York with these various Arab leaders and Muslim leaders, including Indonesia and others, and developed this plan, there was increasing pressure from the West on Israel to stop the war. And people were talking about trade sanctions and other agreements between Israel and Western states. And obviously the recognition issue was out there, signaling a lot of concern about the West Bank. We haven't even talked about what's going on in the West Bank. So now that pressure has dissipated, in the hope that this plan will work, and that's fine. That's what should be happening. If it all falls apart, and depending on who's to blame, irrespective of who's to blame, if it all falls apart and the war starts again, and we have hundreds or thousands of more deaths, then we'll see how long it takes the West to gear up again. Clearly there are people saying it's taking you 2 years to stop what has been going on that was sort of 18 months too long. But on the other hand, there was pressure building. Whether it was going to affect the prime minister in Israel sufficiently to end the war is not clear, but it was important. So Canada is going to wait and see. I hope that they will continue to focus on the West Bank in terms of providing governance assistance, election assistance, funding to begin to move the Palestinian Authority to a place where they can conduct free and fair elections within the year. That's important. I hope they continue to provide money for humanitarian assistance, continue to argue that the UN organizations and international NGOs need to be distributing the aid. That's key. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has been a disaster. So there are things Canada can and should do, but it should be ready to join with its allies, friends of Israel, not necessarily friends of this government, but certainly friends of Israel, to impose sanctions if the war restarts.
One final question to you, Mr. Allen. Where do we go from here?
We have hope that the first phase is completed fairly rapidly and without hitches, and we have to have hope that Witkoff and Kushner are able to convince both sides, really, that the next phase, the key element of the next phase, which is disarmament by Hamas and IDF withdrawal by Israel, happens. Because if that happens, then we can, begin to have slightly more optimism that the next phases of a stabilization force and a technocratic government, etc., could begin to happen. But we really got to get through this first phase, and we've got to get to that next phase of withdrawal and disarmament to have some confidence.
Hey, Mr. Allen, I appreciate your insight and your analysis today. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That was The Big Story. Send us feedback on this episode as well as any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstory.ca, or you can always leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. Would love if you could share this episode with a friend or a family member. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. You can always rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Caryn Ceolin. Thanks so much for listening.